What's up, everyone? Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 135, and I'm the host, Kyle Lanslone, joined by Connor Freeman today. He's a writer at the Libertarian Institute, frequent guest of the show. Connor, welcome back. How you doing today?
I'm great, man. Thanks for having me back on, Kyle.
Excited to have you on today because we have a real important topic to talk about. There are some people who kind of masquerade as being maybe doves, anti-interventionists. Some people would even label them anti-war. But I think in reality, Connor, they're just hots and dove feathers. So gonna get into some of that today. A lot of important stuff. Everybody be sure to share the show. It's hosted at the Libertarian Institute, libertarianinstitute.org/Kyle for a full archive. You can find the show on any of the social media accounts at Facebook, MeWe, or Twitter. Video version at YouTube or Odysee. Donate at Patreon or Subscribestar. The links for all these things are in the show notes page. Make it real easy for everybody to support the show and share the show. And last, you can support the show and get yourself some great CBD products by doing your shopping for CBD products at Paloma Verde. The URL is palomaverdecbd.com. The promo code is PEACE. That'll get you 25% off. Connor, they have a great lineup of products there. I understand, though, you have a favorite, so what do you like?
I really like the tinctures. I get that 1,300 milligram bottle with the mint flavor, and it's just very potent. If you try any other CBD, I've noticed, even from out here in Arizona, marijuana is legal. If you try from any of the dispensaries, this is way better. I've noticed that for sure. Way stronger. There's really not any substitute for a myriad of any reason you may be using it.
Yep. That's one of the reasons I like Paloma Verde is because their products are consistent and they definitely pat the punch that they claim to. It's not, you got a 75 milligram gummy from the old head shop and you don't feel a thing. You're pretty sure they just put a gummy worm in a plastic bag. Versus sometimes I swear that they have some actual THC in them when you get them from those places. So anyways, Paloma Verde for the high quality products. They have their lab tested results right there, so it's exactly what they say it is. Their products work great. PalomaVerdeCBD.com. Promo code PEACE, 25% off when you spend $75 or more. Connor, let's get into the news. And as I said, we have some hots to talk about, but these hots, kind of parade around as doves. And because they talk about some topics like maybe UFOs, Bill Gates, Jeffrey Epstein, people think that they are not hots and, that they kind of parade as populist. Of course, I'm talking about Krystal Ball and her co-host Saagar Enjeti and Connor Enjeti. And Connor, I know you have an article here about them, so tell us about these two and how, as Al McLeod calls them, they're pseudo-populist.
Yeah, so Saagar Enjeti is really a creature of neoconservative think tanks here in America, but you know what? Breaking Points is sort of the new sort of independent show they have. They used to do their show on the Hill. It was called Rising. I believe formerly Buck Sexton was a host on that show, who was also actually, interesting enough, in the CIA. But sort of the marketing of the show is that she's a progressive from MSNBC, in fact, formerly, and he's a conservative, pro-worker, pro-union populist. And so the idea is it really comes out of this podcast they had at the Hudson Institute, where, in fact, Scooter Libby is the senior vice president, and Mike Pompeo actually has a senior position there as well. They had a show there, Saagar did, when he was a media fellow, called The Realignment. And essentially the concept of it is that basically that there's this new trend in politics, and that, it's the traditional left and right, or sort of the conservative neoliberal politics that we grew up with, is no longer really where it's at. It's now more the way Saagar and Krystal sort of present things. And they've had they've had guests on, and as you said, they've talked about topics that ordinarily you don't hear in the corporate media. So people sort of assume that, this is, the way it's kind of like the most mainstream looking ostensibly alternative media show in existence. And so ever since they went independent, I mean, I've been shocked by this myself. They're the number one, I believe, globally, the number one politics podcast, beating out like Steve Bannon's War Room, uh, the Ben Shapiro Show, and Pod Save America and stuff like that. They've
And
been in. Oh,
yeah,
go
can
ahead.
I just add that, these are the two that, when Joe Rogan talked about where he got his news, these are two people that he's named. He's had them on his show. And, they've had on people who are certainly not libertarians. And if any, for libertarians, I think it was kind of hard to be fooled by these two because Saagar particularly liked to pretend that libertarianism was John Bolton and that there was no difference really between Rand Paul and John Bolton. So, it's not like they were ever better on those issues, but from people like that libertarians do I think respect as journalists, Glenn Greenwald, Trita Parsi, Matt Taibbi, along with a lot of others have Aaron Monte have all been on the Morning Rising show, and it was a fairly professional looking studio and show put together. I mean, in terms of quality, it looks like Fox News did a couple of years ago. And so it's really, it seems like they would not be connected to like the Hudson Institute and all this. And so that's why I think it's so important we're getting into this.
Yeah, sure. So we'll get into Sagar's background because he has a very interesting trajectory for a so-called outsider. So he studied, he got his undergrad at George Washington University, and then studied, got a master's in security studies at Georgetown, which, these are very connected to sort of the national security state, as Alan says. Georgetown funds the Center for a New American Security, for instance. Kim Kagan, who will come up later here, actually taught at Georgetown. And so after that, he went and studied counterterrorism at an Israeli university on a former military base called IDC Herzliya. On the board of which sits Ehud Barak, the former prime minister and Mossad chief. And on their international advisory board, it boasts people like James Woolsey, who's, I believe, the acting CIA chief under Bill Clinton, PNAC neocon, who sat on the defense policy board, lying us into Iraq alongside the likes of arch neocons like Richard Pearl. Now, the school itself actually teaches, Alan says, in profiling terrorists, strategy and deterrence, Arab language, Iranian studies. They have a course called Hezbollah, a hybrid terrorist organization. And I like this line. He says, "This is an institution that trains Israeli and American intelligence officials, not radical populist outsiders." He mentions it. Dr. Boaz Ganor, who's an Israeli government advisor, is the head of the Counterterrorism Studies Department. And he was actually praised by the president of the institution for coordinating with the Israeli American Council in the use of the app, which Alan wrote a piece about a little while ago and talked to Scott Horton about, called ACT.il, which is an Israeli government-funded app that they basically, it's like a game of like online information war sort of soldiers, I guess you could say. I mean, they sort of invade social media and then spread Hasbara at times when this Israel needs better PR, like they did this past May when they waged a brutal war on Gaza, for instance. Then Enjeti actually left after studying there. He goes to the Institute for the Study of War, which was founded by Kim Kagan, who's Fred Kagan's wife. She was heavily involved in, for instance, the Afghan war surge, embedded there with Petraeus. In fact, Robbie Martin, who's quoted in this, made an excellent documentary, my favorite documentary on the neoconservatives, called A Very Heavy Agenda, where he shows Petraeus receiving an award from Kim Kagan, and he references how Kim Kagan, the Kagans, work him like a puppet. He can feel the hand up behind his back, kind of working him like a puppet. And they're funded by Raytheon, General Dynamics, DynCorp, etc. They were involved in the push for war in Iraq. And the quote from Robbie Martin here is: the Institute for the Study of War is one of the most enmeshed DC think tanks in terms of active military policy with the U.S. government. It is probably the most influential military-centric think tank in Washington. It is always encouraging war, which should be obvious by its name. If people have ever had the misfortune to watch Fox News and see Jack Keane on there, for instance, the former general, who's one of the worst hawks in our society, he's from the Institute for the Study of War. Bill Krystal also sits on their board, for instance. Now, of course, this is the Kagan family, one of the most powerful, probably the most powerful and influential neoconservative family in America. Robert Kagan, for instance, founded Project for a New American Century with Bill Krystal. These were, infamously wrote the Rebuilding America's Defenses paper, which kind of outlined certainly the foreign policy going into the 2000s. These people were embedded in particularly the first George W. Bush administration. Don Kagan and Fred Kagan, for instance, were on a radio show on September 12th, where they were saying the day after 9/11, calling for the Delta Force to go into the West Bank and clean it out. Robert Kagan and Bill Krystal at the Weekly Standard infamously really kind of conflated 9/11 and the Al Qaeda attacks on 9/11 with Saddam Hussein, kind of greasing the skids there for the invasion. And Victoria Nuland, of course, is Robert Kagan's wife, who is now the highest-ranking member of the Foreign Service here in the United States, and she engineered the coup in Ukraine, in 2014, where they started a war that killed more than 10,000 people in the east of the country and put a Nazi-infested regime in power on Russia's doorstep. So that's where Saagar comes from. Saagar, wrote papers on the Taliban and the war in Afghanistan while he was at the Institute for the Study of War. Then after that, he went to the Hudson Institute, which is also funded by arms companies, the military-industrial complex firms like Raytheon and Northrop Grumman, Lockheed Martin. And their president is the former George W. Bush drug czar, John P. Walters. As I already said, Scooter Libby and Pompeo are there. And the guy is completely in bed, it seems to me, with the neoconservatives and has taken a sharp anti-China stance that's very arguably, as influential probably as Tucker Carlson is for the older demographic. Which is the Hudson Institute is funded by Taiwan, in particular Japan, South Korea. So it's a huge conflict of interest, to borrow a phrase, for this guy to be out there, posturing as some sort of anti-establishment guy when he's really just recycling neoconservative propaganda.
Yeah, but he does have a nice filter to him, Connor, because again, he's been, I don't want to say like good on these issues, but been willing to at least talk about issues like Epstein, like Bill Gates, even when it comes to things like obvious corruption in Congress. Him and Krystal did a lot of coverage on, members of Congress who either sold off or bought shares in certain companies in relation to like different events around the pandemic, having foreknowledge and getting rich off of stuff like that. And so these don't seem to be the actions of necessarily a hawk, but at the same time, I think he adds as something of like a sheep herder here, Connor, making sure that people don't think we could really cast off the empire or anything like that. Yeah, sure, maybe we shouldn't be fighting the endless wars overseas and stuff like that, but at the same time, China. China is evil. China is coming from us. China has terrible business practices. China's stealing all of our monies. You're poor because of China. America is losing our business and competitive edge because of China. And China, 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 China. That's, one of his big things. And so it's just, it's so nefarious that this guy is able to kind of parade as being and capture a lot of people who I think lean non-interventionist, somebody like a Joe Rogan, because he's willing to say the war in Afghanistan may not be a good idea. The war in Iraq may not be a good idea. We have too much militarism. Maybe it sounds a little American first about it. But then good on Russiagate. That was another one that, him and Krystal didn't buy into Russiagate. But at the same time, they've been able to make sure everybody doesn't wander too far away. You don't take too many of the red pills. We got to keep you making sure you're buying into the fact that we need government, we need regulation. He's big on regulation. He's not a free market guy at all. He regularly criticizes Rand Paul for being too free market. Not even criticizes, he mocks Rand Paul because he doesn't have an actual criticism for it. And so again, especially now with them leaving the Rising show, which was The Hill, which it did appear even as Morning Rising to be independent media because it wasn't on a cable TV show, and they did interview people from the Quincy Institute, Greenwald and Taibbi, Katie Halper, but and all those people have promoted the Breaking Point show, and so we have to know who we're dealing with here. And that's why I'm really glad we got into this and broke it down. Is there anything else from this article we need to talk about, Connor?
Well, yeah, I mean, I'll just say that overall, I think he's sort of part of a larger pattern. Tucker Carlson, despite the most recent controversies about him apparently being spied on by the NSA, he's another big China hawk. Tried to join the CIA. His father was vice chairman of the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, probably the most powerful anti-Iran neoconservative think tank in America. He's vice chairman for like 8 years, from 2003 to 2011, I think. He's, like I said, I believe might have been the longest running director of Voice of America. Used to head the U.S. Agency for Information. He was even an ambassador. And Tucker, has had his own shows. He postures as being like this kind of a populist or whatever. But he had his own shows on MSNBC, on CNN, on Fox News. He worked for Bill Krystal at the Weekly Standard. And, he actually was Saagar's boss when Saagar was working for the Daily Caller. And Tucker wrote the introduction for Krystal and Saagar's book. I think it's called A Populist Guide to 2020 or something. And Nina Turner also wrote an introduction there, which, so when back when Bernie was still running for president, when the false accusations came out about Trump and Bernie being backed by the Russians, instead of saying this is ridiculous McCarthyite nonsense, Nina Turner went on CNN when she was working for Sanders' campaign and said, unlike Trump, Senator Sanders doesn't worship at the feet of Vladimir Putin. Of course, we have Bernie Sanders, who supports airstrikes in Syria and sanctions on Russia. He's famously on his campaign website, he said we need to phase out Assad. It's Steve Bannon, who's also another guy who's supposedly anti-establishment, has that think tank, the Committee on the Present Danger China, with Frank Gaffney, of all people, one of the most completely neocons.
We could add Tim Pool to that list.
Oh, sure.
We've covered a lot on this show. We don't have to talk about here. Anybody who wants to look up conflicts of interest and search Patrick McFarlane. Essentially, every time he's been on the show, we've been breaking down and discussing the China issue, which is so important because that's part of what these populists are using are the fake narratives that China. I shouldn't say all fake narratives, but particularly the ones that we've covered with Pat, like about the genocide and organ harvesting claims, have been have been fake, but there are, real like crimes that China commits. They're cracking down on democracy in Hong Kong, stuff like that. I don't want to say it's all bunk, but most of it is. And so, them feeding off of the narratives put forward by groups like China Uncensored is pretty concerning.
Yeah, absolutely. And also, I mean, Donald Trump is a perfect example, a guy who was ostensibly fighting the neocons and the deep state or whatever. And he was arguably one of the most subservient presidents. I mean, the neoconservatives, that they're leading the anti-Russia, anti-China charge, and nobody did more to exacerbate tensions with both states than Donald Trump since the Cold War. Arguably so, and especially ripping up the Iran, leaving all the arms treaties and abrogating the Iran deal and moving the embassy and the policy on settlements and his fealty to Israel. It's just, so I mean, I feel like the new policy, whether it's coordinated or not, is they realize that people like John McCain and Hillary Clinton just won't do it anymore with the younger generations. So they have to be more. I'm not saying like all these people are completely sort of in on some sort of op, but it is sort of divided, like at a restaurant, if they were doing side work or something where it's like you do the China stuff, but you're good on, Saagar claims that his what he calls North Star is because his whole political career is based on his reaction to 9/11 and the war in Iraq. And it's my inspiration to this day. Well, nobody who really is, just committed to opposing neoconservatism would take the trajectory that he did. So, there is something very nefarious, as you say, going on. And
yeah. Let's before we wrap on these two, play this one very short clip of, I believe this is Krystal and Saagar finding out that Assange will face criminal charges.
So we accidentally learned that Julian Assange has been indicted.
So not only that, we might have actually just complicated a very, very fractious diplomacy that's going on right now, because there is a lot of behind-the-scenes negotiations going on between the U.S., the U.K., and Ecuador. Ecuador is completely sick of Julian Assange. They want them to get the heck out of there.
They want him out, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's to the point where...
He's been there for 6 years.
Not only is that, but Julian refuses to clean up his cat's litter box. He is like... like in court filings, they're having major lawsuits against each other because Julian refuses to clean his room. He's a grown man. He's like in his 40s, and the man will not clean his room and clean up after his cat. He also refuses to shower more than once a week.
What?
Yeah, it's disgusting. Like, so...
I'm glad you're on, because I didn't know any of those details, and they're important.
Everybody should read this story.
So that was just embarrassing that they would buy was mostly like straight up propaganda that was collected by the CIA to use against Julian Assange. But the reaction to finding out that journalists had been indicted for doing journalism was to laugh and mock him for claiming that he didn't clean up after his cat enough, which wasn't even true. And so I think that's just very revealing and exposing of who they are. Anyways, Connor, anything else before we move on here?
I'll just say, I mean, this guy has actually, there's a good clip, I think, of him on the realignment with Krystal, where he says explicitly he doesn't want a multipolar world. In other words, he's basically Charles Kruthammer. He goes, I want the U.S. to be the only blue water navy. And says he doesn't want China to control the South China Sea, which, however you feel about it, that's like China saying our foreign policy now is to ensure that the U.S. does not control, the Gulf of Mexico, or, so I mean, the real issue is he talks about COVID, and a lot of these guys from Hudson talk about COVID as being some sort of conspiracy that the Communist Chinese Party unleashed on the world to upend the world system, that they need to be brought to heel, as David Asher, a senior fellow there, said on Fox News. And he goes, if we had known all this stuff about the lab leak theory, and he's not taking like the Sam Husseini approach, talking about Pentagon money going to the Wuhan lab and, the National Institute of Health connection, et cetera. He's talking about it like it's some big conspiracy of the Chinese Communist Party to, to kill
or
all these
at
people.
the very least suggest that it was their incompetence that was the cause of it. It was China's fault is his goal.
And he
Anyways,
says our foreign policy would be different, and I don't know what kind of escalation he wanted beyond what Trump has done and what Biden has done with planes buzzing their coast 3 to 5 times a day and the warships having a near constant presence in the South China Sea. It's just I don't know. I mean, I feel like a lot of people that listen to that stuff are not totally aware of that's constantly occurring. So they see all this kind of in a vacuum. It's very dangerous.
Right. All right, so let's get into some Iran news here, where I think if you look at the U.S. and Iranian media, or I guess official sources, again, Connor, we kind of have this situation where the Iranians are suggesting that, hey, maybe we're pretty close to a deal, and the Americans saying, nah, not so much, and if we don't get a deal done, I wouldn't be surprised. And so I'm just curious, I haven't talked on the show probably in a week or week and a half about where we are with the talks. We know the 6th round of talks ended. The 7th round of talks hasn't started yet. But what are the two countries saying about the possibility for saving the JCPOA?
Well, I would say that, I've heard statements from both sides saying essentially that the Iranians have said that they have a steadfast commitment to the negotiations to revive the deal. We know with the new president coming in that he supports a return to the deal if the U.S. lifts sanctions, despite all the hype about him being a hardliner who can't be reasoned with. In fact, Bloomberg had a piece recently where they quoted a guy from the FDD who was essentially saying that that's it because I don't know. I guess they were sort of implying that he won't accept the potentially so-called longer and stronger deal, which would, of course, involve they're going to try and press concessions out of the Iranians dealing with ballistic missiles and their independent foreign policy, or as they call it, support for terrorists or whatever. And so he's saying that's a done deal. But certainly they can return to the JCPOA. The Ayatollah supports a return to the JCPOA if the Americans lift the sanctions. But on the other hand, the Americans have been saying that, there's quotes from Blinken. He was in Paris last month with his French counterpart there, and he was talking about how there's still serious differences. There's going to be a time when we can never return to the deal. I'm not saying when that time is, but it's something we are conscious of. He's talking about how, echoing a lot of some of the Israeli rhetoric about how the new centrifuges are just kind of beyond the pale, and we can never return to the deal potentially if that goes on. But as the Iranian Foreign Ministry spokesman has said that they've repeated endlessly that they can reverse all those remedial efforts immediately and return to compliance with the deal, but on the condition that the U.S. lifts sanctions and returns to the deal. I believe it's Articles 26 and 36 of the JCPOA that allows Iran to, basically walk away from some of its commitments if another state in the P5+1, in this case the United States, are not upholding their end of the deal, which of course they left the deal. The U.S. is in violation of the deal. But it's I know that Ned Price came out, I think just the other day, and said the ball is really in Iran's court. Speaking of that French foreign minister, he was saying that if the Iranians don't make these hard decisions to return to the deal, there's not much we can do, sort of acting like, Iran is the problem. They haven't made enough concessions. And so I'm not exactly sure where it's going from here, but the Biden administration has severely messed things up because they have not lifted sanctions. They've been dragging their feet. And at the same time, you have the Israelis, launching sabotage attacks on like the Natanz facility back in April when these indirect talks with Vienna got started. They damaged centrifuges and caused a power outage there. And they just recently did another attack at the end of June in Karaj, in a city outside of Tehran, where they hit a building that Iran's Atomic Energy Agency has, where they produce centrifuges. The damage, from what initially Iran tried to play down the damage. They've recently accused Israel of doing the attack, and they've said that the roof was damaged and it had to be removed and for repairs. They said damage to the equipment was not remarkable. This was what an Iranian official had said. But at the same time, it's not looking good to me because obviously you have the Biden administration bombing targets in Syria and Iraq and saying what they're really doing is deterring Iran, and Biden kind of boasting about this in his meeting in the Oval Office with speaking to the press with sitting next to Israel's president. We've had several visits from the Israelis recently really pushing the Americans to not accept the deal, and now we're hearing absurd things like the Israelis are considering a U.S. return to the deal where they maintain Trump's sanctions, which is just an impossibility. So,
right. Yeah, that's like, saying that you could rent this house, but you can't live in it. So the Iranians aren't going to get back into that deal. Good job breaking that all down, Connor. There's a lot there. I like how, in the U.S. media, though, they never really connect the idea that things like attacking the militias in Iraq and Syria, Israel's sabotage are major impacts for Iran and their decision to get back into the deal. And really all the focus is, will Iran make enough concessions for the U.S. to get back into it? Before we move on to talk about Afghanistan, though, I want to talk about our old friend Michelle Flournoy. And apparently she visited Rudy Giuliani and Mike Pompeo's favorite Iranian terrorist, the MEK. Although I guess the State Department doesn't officially list them as terrorists anymore, but they did at one point. And she went and gave a speech to the MEK. And this isn't major news, Connor, but a big war hawk and an international interventionist has a real stain on her record. And this is something that could be used to leverage to keep her out of the halls of power. So what happened here?
Well, it was pretty funny to see her have to do this about face. I've never seen Rudy Giuliani or John Bolton have to come out and go, "I didn't know I was speaking to the MEK. I'm sending the money back, and I would never do it again."
It's believable with Giuliani, right? Like, I don't know who I was talking. Like, you assume that like Bolton and Pompeo, Michelle Flournoy know like the layout and the geopolitics of the Middle East well enough, but Rudy Giuliani, like, that guy, he'll go and talk anywhere for a couple dollars and a free lunch.
It sounds like you get some of these people get paid as high as $50,000.
Right.
So she came out. Actually, West Exec Advisors, a spokesperson, had to come out and make that statement. I basically just paraphrased, which was her, her military-industrial complex consulting firm she founded with Antony Blinken. But yeah, no, she went there, and let's see, what are some of the quotes? She said she called for internal regime change in Iran and called the MEK, who she didn't know what it was, an important diaspora group. When there is an internal regime change, when a government comes to power that renounces its revolutionary aims and terrorism, the United States will be the first in line to engage it. We must continue to applaud and support the important work of diaspora groups like yours that keep alive the vision of a secular, free, and democratic Iran.
See, so right there, to me, there's no possible way in hell Michelle Flournoy didn't know who she was talking to. I mean, there could be maybe like one or two or three possible Iranian diaspora groups, right? And I mean, the MEK is the major one. Maybe there's some Azeris that live outside of Iran, maybe some Sunni, but the main thing is the MEK. And if she didn't at least bother to ask, then that's a major problem. So I think this is going to be a real problem for her because she's apologized for it. And so now it could always be spun as you had to do that and apologize. And her excuse is, I was too stupid to understand who I was talking to, even though I kind of knew who I was talking to. Right? Like, yeah. She put herself in a really bad position. She would have been better off by taking the John Bolton route and been like, what, you support the Ayatollah? You just love Iran. You hate America. You're an evil terrorist. Oh my God, yeah. Look at this guy. He's a Muslim extremist.
Yeah, she's still, I mean, what is she going to do? Like, leave her chair on the board, or, her chairmanship of the board there at Center for New American Security, which, the only reason I thought, beyond the kind of gallows humor of this and how ridiculous it is a couple of things. So also at the event speaking were Mike Pompeo, Donna Brazile, and Bob Menendez, the chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, who's really a neocon. Democratic senator. And but what she's, she's seen as has a really disproportionate influence on the Biden administration. With Eli Ratner and Kurt Campbell there, Avril Haines is connected to CNAS. Among others. But that's her project. And what she did say, she said was, she goes, and of course her connection with Blinken, she warned that the Iranian government should not expect an easy ride from this administration or Congress. And this woman was supposed to be, she was supposed to head the Pentagon until Lloyd Austin was selected. So I have a feeling that she's just cashing in. It's kind of crazy because this is a group that has killed Americans. I mean, they're a cult that kills Iranian scientists. They were the most likely perpetrators of the murder of Mohsen Fakhrizadeh at the end of last year, the Iranian scientist. So, I mean, like you said, there's no way she doesn't know what this is. She's a lifetime, essentially a lifetime foreign policy apparatchik. Former Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, helped engineer the wars in Libya and Syria, et cetera, the Afghan surge. So there's no way she doesn't know what she was doing. But I just found it interesting that, first of all, I was just surprised to see Donna Brazile was there. But it seems like, you've got Menendez. I wonder how much weight what she said about don't expect an easy ride. Because at the same time, there's another note I picked up at the Responsible Statecraft is Reza Pahlavi, the heir apparent to the Shah, just gave a speech to the I think it's the Conference of Presidents of Major American Jewish Organizations, which opposed the Iran deal. And he gave a speech. Basically it was like, we need democracy in Iran, which is, just as outrageous. But there's something weird going on, because also Stoltenberg met with the Israeli foreign minister here just recently. Rick Rosroff had a piece about it at antiwar.com about how they basically, Stoltenberg came out and criticized, you want to laugh, criticized, with standing next to Yair Lapid, criticized Iran for apparent, supposed violations of the Non-Proliferation Treaty.
Right.
It's just outrageous. Obviously Israel is the one who's in violation. Right. They're not even a signatory. They have a clandestine nuclear weapons program. But I thought that was interesting too, that he went out of his way to condemn Iran in his meeting with the Israeli foreign minister. But it's just very bizarre. A lot of meetings are taking place, and I know that Israel is also stepping up coordination with the Gulf states, and actually, since April, especially when these talks kicked off. And I know that's one of the priorities of Ibrahim Raisi, the incoming president in Iran, to sort of actually repair relations with those states. So, there's kind of this institutional hawkishness against Iran with the Abraham Accords and the legacy of the Trump administration. So I don't see this really going anywhere good, but who knows? Maybe the Americans will, with Zarif and Rouhani, wrap it up with the moderates before the new president takes over, because Elliot Abrams and these neocons are ready to really take advantage of the ostensible hardliner coming to power.
Right.
And just.
All right, Connor, I want to move on and talk to you about Afghanistan here, where just last week, Joe Biden gave kind of a speech where he said that the U.S. mission in Afghanistan was ending on August 31st. And I was like, that's, kind of interesting, because you say you're going to keep like 650 troops in the country. And so that really doesn't sound like the mission ending. But since that time, we've gotten some hints and more stories from the U.S. administration that really sounds like they're going to keep the war going more so than just the 650 troops that are likely going to be stationed at the embassy. Connor, what have we heard in the past couple of weeks?
Yeah. So, essentially that. So I think the withdrawal aspect of the so-called withdrawal is probably finished. So there was that report that came out in Politico where they said there were two unnamed officials who said the plan at this point is to, in addition to the Afghan forces forward, the new military command based out of the embassy, which we'll get to that in a sec, but I guess there's going to be 600 troops, they've said, because initially there was like 650, 1,000. It was kind of it was unclear. But this report, which I think is probably the most recent number, they're suggesting that there's going to be 600 troops staying in the country, divided up somehow between being stationed at the embassy and also at the Kabul airport, the embassy and the Kabul embassy as well. And these are Army and Marine forces. And so essentially, you've got now with Scott Miller stepping down and handing over authority in this ceremony this week to Frank McKenzie at CENTCOM, General Frank McKenzie, the authority to bomb Afghanistan with the so-called over-the-horizon capabilities, which as of now, it looks like most of that will be coming from, bases in the Gulf, or aircraft carriers in the Persian Gulf or in the Indian Ocean, as John Kirby, the Pentagon spokesman, was just saying. But it looks like, to me that, they said that the last people to leave would be Scott Miller and his staff. So everybody else is going to be remaining after the new August 31st deadline. So what's going on now is Turkey and the U.S. have come to an agreement apparently on what they called the scope of the mission at the airport. The Afghan Forces Forward Military Command at the Kabul embassy, which is going to be headed by a Navy Rear Admiral Peter Vasily, will have 4 aspects to its mission, including advising and assisting the Afghan national security and defense forces, and a counterterrorism mission as well, in addition to what we were initially told, which was they're just there to protect a diplomatic presence. But the compound itself has about 4,000 people working inside the embassy, including, or actually, I think 1,400 U.S. citizens. There was the Associated Press report. That's what it said, and 4,000 people working at the compound. They can, if they haven't been able to base any CIA in the area that we know of. So I assume since you can fit thousands of people there, and Dave DeCamp has talked about how you can have drones at the embassy as well. And we know that if you read Moon of Alabama, he talks about drones being stationed at the embassy, as well as I forget which publication it was, but there were sources coming out saying that they're going to have an airport crew, an air crew offering like a helicopter, working with the helicopters there. So, they were concerned, of course, about the Afghan Air Force not being able to maintain its helicopters. I wonder if that's sort of an interim solution. They also have that the U.S. and Turkey are going to have that CRAM system, a counter. I think it's a counter rocket artillery mortar system. Obviously, they've got missile systems there and interceptor systems. So it's both the airport and the embassy are heavily militarized.
And I think the CRAM system, right, that actually fires mortars. Like, if a rocket attack comes in, it triangulates where the attack is coming from, and then it uses that information to fire mortars back. And so it's not like we're just talking about like air defense systems or something here. We're talking about weapon systems. That this is essentially a military base. It's not like the embassy that any American would see in Washington, D.C. or New York City.
And so I mean it's looking to me, they're talking about how actually one of the most interesting notes is, well, first of all, I think that the reports have come out that there was, the documents that were left at the bus stop in Kent that suggested, I think it was secret UK eyes only. They were talking about the Americans requesting that the British keep special forces there. Then there was a report out in the London Telegram, that said they interviewed a former British Special Air Services soldier who said the deal is as good as done, that they're going to have an indefinite presence there as an advisory group, sort of analogous to to John Kirby talking about the advise and assist mission that the Americans will be still maintaining there from the embassy command, which also will be complemented by another Afghanistan office in Qatar, which is another base where they're going to be launching airstrikes from. It was last June that John Roth, the acting Air Force Secretary, told, I believe it was a Senate committee, that they need $10 billion. He goes, we have he talked about how there's, the bases in the Gulf. He goes, those aren't going anywhere. That's where your over-the-horizon capability will come from. And those are, they have one in the UAE, one in Qatar, and then another and two bases in Kuwait. And there's a report out at Common Dreams now where they're talking about how, Biden in his own, kind of strange way during his speech announcing the new August 31st deadline, he was asked all these questions from sort of the hawkish press corps there. They asked him, if there is evidence that Kabul is threatened, which some of the intelligence reports have suggested it could be in 6 months or thereabout, do you think you've got the capability to help provide any kind of air support, military support to help to them to keep the capital safe, even if the U.S. troops are obviously fully out by that time? And Biden said, we have worked out an over-the-horizon capacity that we can be value added, but the Afghans are going to have to be able to do it themselves with the Air Force they have, which we're helping them maintain. And the report goes on to say, when the president refers to the over-the-horizon capacity, he's referring that can be value added. He's referring to the plan I just referenced, the $10 billion plan to fly drones and manned attack aircraft from those bases in the Gulf. To now, this is the first official acknowledgement that they may be using that to actually bomb the Taliban, which was the question that was on everybody's mind. If major provincial capitals and Kabul, for instance, or Kandahar City come under real threat and are contested by the Taliban, the U.S. might actually start bombing the Taliban in support of the Afghan military to prevent a real fall of Kabul. And I think so. For instance, there was actually a report in the New York Times a little while ago that suggested that this was an ongoing debate amongst officials, and it was sort of unclear. And in congressional testimony, Lloyd Austin talked about how they would bomb targets that could pose a threat to our homeland. So people assume that meant Al Qaeda, ISIS, that sort of thing, and so they were able to sort of say, well, this is like a counterterrorism mission, etc. But now he never denied that they would possibly bomb the Taliban. It's looking like that might actually be what the plan is ultimately, which would make sense for keeping this. Actually, it's really not a withdrawal. It's a significant reduction of the presence there. They've given up Kandahar Airfield and Bagram Air Base, etc. But it looks like they've looked at what I think that they have been scrambling, and they weren't able to get those bases they wanted in the Central Asian countries or in Pakistan. And so I think they've tried to cover their bases. Like I said, having the air crew there for the helicopters, and keeping who knows how many what undeclared presence they have just with like mercenaries that are going to be there at the embassy or potentially at the airport, and what kind of aircraft will be stationed at both locations.
Yeah. One thing I've really noticed, Connor, is this whole drawdown period has seemed, as you mentioned, somewhat chaotic from the Biden administration, where it doesn't seem they really had their mind made up, and yet officials are kind of leaking different statements and stuff like that. And so at times, if you listen to certain sources, it seems like the war is coming to an end almost in the way me and you would say that, the war, define the war coming to an end. And then other times, it seems like nowhere near that situation, that essentially it was a significant drawdown of the U.S. presence in Afghanistan. Essentially, we've withdrawn our presence, at least our main base, back to our embassy in Kabul. But at the same time, we're going to continue to bomb, including the Taliban, and continue to carry out covert actions. And, those are two radically different things, whether this is ending a war or not. And I guess one of the things I think that's problematic is that the Afghan state is a corrupt absolute mess, and this includes the armed forces. And so now the Taliban, I don't think they're right, but they're claiming they control 85% of the country. Seems like an exaggeration. It may be closer to the fact that if you just look at like overall area, not population, that the Afghan government like firmly controls about 15% or something like that. Maybe that's true. But it is a lot of the country that is controlled by the Taliban. They have taken a lot of ground there in recent weeks with their offensive. And so my concern, Connor, is that this is just too much of a black eye for the Biden administration to handle. And so I think they, maybe come to the conclusion that we have to bomb. Just at least, the phrase that they used like 4 years ago when Trump was thinking about withdrawing was looking for a decent interval, right? The whole Vietnam thing. It wasn't the war wasn't like officially lost with like the helicoptering of the diplomats of the embassy in Saigon, right? That the U.S. actually like ended the military operations a couple years before that. And so the whole idea would be, you would look for what they call a decent interval a couple of years before the country completely falls. And he's going to look like maybe at best get a couple months out of this thing, just because, again, we've given all this money to the Afghan government, but if you give money to a corrupt government, it actually makes the situation worse. Connor, any final thoughts on Afghanistan? If not, we need again to talk about all this Russia and new Cold War stuff.
Sure. So I'll just say that it seems to me that the Taliban have said actually recently that they have dismissed the idea that they're going to target the Kabul airport. It's kind of laughable, but the Afghans have said that the Afghan military have said they can defend the airport. But they actually, the Taliban, it was a spokesman who put out a statement that we don't want to attack NGOs and diplomats and embassies and workers, because these are things that that our people need, that the people of Afghanistan need. But what's I think problematic is that you're going to have, essentially, if they attack the embassy, it's like they're attacking a military base, as we've said. There's a military target, but it could possibly be spun as they're attacking the embassy, and they're sort of framing it like, well, we're only there to, half the time they talk about how it's like it's really just to protect the diplomats and diplomatic presence. But I think that's a major target. They've captured a lot of vehicles from the Afghan military. They said June was the deadliest month. I think Tolo News reported that a deadliest month in the war. I mean, who knows how accurate those statistics are, but the Afghans have evacuated 120 districts, the Afghan military, that is. And so, the scale and the pace of the Taliban retaking territory has been, just pretty impressive. So I wouldn't be it just seems to me like we're setting up a situation where they've captured quite a bit of long range artillery. They may make a move against the embassy. I just don't see where this goes, because I just think inevitably it's going to be the Taliban attacking the embassy, either because they were attacked directly. And they've announced that if the foreign troops stay after after August 31st, they'll be viewed as invaders. And then that looks to me like it opens up a whole new kind of war. But it doesn't seem to me that the Americans want too chaotic of a situation to happen, especially in anticipation of the midterms and the next election coming. Just for political reasons, that would look awful. So I don't know what they're thinking, if they think they've got just enough to be able to keep things relatively stable to the worst case scenario for the next year or so, or something like that, or however long. But I just see this going in a very, very bad direction, unless they say that the Taliban says that they're going to be, both sides will be presenting peace plans to each other next month, and they say that they're still committed to the Doha talks. It just seems like really we should just get out of there. But I don't know it'll be very interesting to see what happens at the end of August, the beginning of September.
Right. All right, Connor, let's talk about the new Cold War with Russia and all the developments and hawkish things the U.S. is doing in Eastern Europe. We just had the Sea Breeze massive naval exercises, 32 countries involved. I think that's finally concluded. But that doesn't mean that we don't have rats like Victoria Nuland running around Ukraine and potentially creating a real nasty situation. So, Connor, tell us about what's going on there.
Well, with Bella, so Victoria Nuland just got off the line on a phone call with the head of the president's office in Ukraine, and they were discussing the situation in Belarus because Ukraine has been hyping up. They claim that Belarus poses a threat to them. I haven't really seen too much evidence of that. There's a military exercise coming up soon with between Russia and Belarus. But as Rick Rosroff says, it's a routine one, and Ukraine has no reason to fear anything from it. It's kind of ridiculous for Ukraine to be complaining about, making, and Victoria Nuland, for instance, the Americans and NATO to be, hyping up this sort of, like, oh, you're exercising near our borders. I don't even. It just seems like an outrageous claim. But Victoria Nuland coming into this situation now, speaking about Belarus and getting involved there, is troubling because Belarus recently just sealed its border, its 675-mile border with Ukraine, because they claim that Ukraine that weapons have been smuggled into to terrorist groups from Ukraine. And that these groups are being, armed by. He talks about from the president said from Lithuania, Poland, Ukraine, Germany, and America. And so he talks about how. Let's see. He goes, I'm astounded by the amount of weapons being smuggled from Ukraine to Belarus. I mentioned it last year. Many didn't believe me. This is why I've instructed the border guard to fully close off the border with Ukraine. And there have been a lot of drills in the area, especially with the Defender Europe 21 exercises and all these other exercises that are constantly ongoing, it seems, under Biden in the Black Sea and around the Black Sea. You've pointed out that the Russians have said accused NATO of smuggling weapons to Ukrainian groups in these drills, like probably some of the fascist groups there as well. And that's actually what the president here is talking about. He says that a Telegram channel was formed under the name Belarus Self-Defense Formations, has 2,500 subscribers. It was their combat reserve. We know their faces. The chat's owner is Mr. de Hoffman, a German citizen who was previously a citizen of Russia and Ukraine. Mr. Dudenkov, a Russian citizen, is the main moderator of the operation. Talked about a sabotage group that tried to set fire to forestry vehicles and were caught in the attempt failed. But he also said another group of saboteurs attempted to blow up a Russian Navy communications facility in a town called Vilika. But the would-be perpetrators, Rick Rosroff reports here, were arrested. And Lukashenko said, the president of Belarus said he talked about this with Putin. He's instructed his foreign ministry to summon the ambassadors from those NATO mentions that I mentioned earlier, and he's requesting that they extradite these saboteurs and insurrectionists. He says, we don't. All the facts are documented. We will prove their guilt. We don't even have to prove it. They will talk about it on their own, and you will see their true face, the face of Germans, Americans, Poles, and Lithuanians. And it's just very interesting that now Victoria Nuland is getting involved because, of course, of her role as Assistant Secretary of State for Eurasian Affairs under the Obama administration when she engineered a coup in 2014, arming essentially, really engineering a coup that put Nazis in power in Kiev, and a very far right ultra-nationalist government that really wants they're very anti-Russian. As they launched a war, of course, in the Donbass, and thousands of people have been killed. And so it's not a good sign. I mean, things really obviously got out of hand there when you had, even Islam, so I think the New York Times reported in 2015 about, so the brothers of the Islamic State going and fighting, ethnic Russians in the Donbass. So things can get very out of hand very easily in these kinds of situations. And so, I'm not exactly sure what's going on, but there's what's going to happen next. But there's a lot of tension around Belarus. Also, actually, the Lebanon Triangle, which is Poland, Lithuania, and Ukraine. Their foreign ministers just got together and talked about how they're committed to the Crimean platform, and they want to deoccupy Crimea and evict the Russians from Sevastopol, their Black Sea fleet. You have the foreign minister of Ukraine additionally calling for increased coordination with NATO, with the Ukrainian Navy, to avoid like the Kerch Strait incident from 3 years ago, which seems like he wants the NATO to accompany Ukrainian ships when they may decide to confront the Russians, because in that incident when they were trying to enter the Sea of Azov, 3 vessels were basically intercepted by the Russians and kind of it was so that they basically, I mean, the situation here is now they want to further militarize the region with the 2 new bases that the Ukrainians are going to be building in the Sea of Azov and the Black Sea. And so I'm not, it seems like there's quite a bit more to go, but there's just been, increasing drills that are going on. There's going to be these 3 swords exercises, the 3 swords 21 exercises with Lithuania, Poland, and Ukraine that are coming up, and the Americans are leading in Ukraine. We can go anywhere you want from there. There's actually, please go ahead.
No, go ahead with where you're going.
Well, I was just going to say that we're talking more about Poland. Also, the Poles are expected to purchase 250 Abrams battle tanks from the Americans as well. And it's going to be a purchase of $3 to $5 billion. They talk about how a defense ministry spokesman says these modern tanks are a necessity for to meet the requirements of the modern battlefield. And just with the way they're talking about, kind of, this is sort of leading up to eventually a confrontation with the Russians. I mean, it's not just purely a racket for the military-industrial complex, but what battlefield are they talking about? As Rick says, it's areas that border Poland, Belarus, Kaliningrad, between Lithuania and Poland, the Russians based there, and Ukraine.
Yeah. Well, Connor, I mean, is there anything else we get into? We're about at an hour now. But if there's anything we missed on the new Cold War, we certainly don't want to skip over it, just because it's so important to make sure we're covering all of this, where, the U.S. is building up in Eastern Europe with NATO. We're arming up the Poles and Lithuania and all these other countries, Ukraine, and then we're exercising all these naval drills that are very provocative. Essentially, if it were happening in the Gulf of Mexico with the Mexicans, just imagine how irate the United States would be. And this is far more than the equivalent to that. You would have to then start including all the Caribbean countries to try to have some kind of equation, because the U.S. carries out these games not just between the U.S. and a couple European countries, but 32 countries, including countries from all over the world. This is completely crazy. So what else are we missing on the new Cold War?
Well, yes. So one of the things that was mentioned is that basically this Lublin triangle between Lithuania, Poland, and Ukraine, they're talking about, speaking of what was going on in Belarus, they put out a statement how they want to support the Belarusian people in their just aspiration to live in a free democratic country where human rights are protected. And they even talked about bringing Belarusian civil society into the Lublin Triangle activities. And some of that rhetoric almost sounds like what the sort of catchphrase at the time of the Ukraine coup was, when they go, "We want a Europe whole, free, and at peace." It's just very interesting, because you have these accusations of these terrorists being armed in Belarus by, for instance, Lithuania and Poland and Ukraine and the Americans and the Germans, and now they're talking about bringing them into this Lublin Triangle alliance on the heels of these drills that are coming up now soon as well. So, and we also see, speaking of the Black Sea, the U.S. is now deploying. They deployed F-16s to Bulgaria for they call the Thracian Star military exercise that's going to be conducted by U.S. Air Forces in Europe and U.S. Air Force Africa, where they're going to be practicing shooting essentially Russian aircraft. So they talk about it'll provide the American Air Force the opportunity of engaging in mock combat encounters with Russian-designed aircraft. Bulgaria is providing Sukhoi Su-25 ground attack aircraft and Mi-24 helicopters for the purpose. Maneuvers are going to occur in Bulgaria, Greece, Romania, and will include quote, offensive counter-air and defensive counter-air, protection of high-value assets, and close air support in a contested environment. And in the past, they've had 32 F-16s involved in these exercises. And additionally, we have B-52 bombers last month flying over the Black Sea, accompanied by Turkish F-16s. And the U.S. announced it's funding a $152 million construction project in Romania to transform the airbase Câmpia Turzii into a new major hub for NATO aircraft in the Black Sea region. And also, the U.S. is going to be basing both surveillance and combat drones, MQ-9 Reapers, at the Romanian Air Force Base 71 at Câmpia Turzii. So it just seems like since Biden has come in, he almost immediately sent those warships. There's been 5 already outside of these drills, 5 U.S. warships in the Black Sea. For instance, training with the Ukrainian Navy. The one in particular, Donald Cook, I believe it was in February, was buzzed by Russian aircraft. And the next day they said we're doing drills with that same vessel with the Ukrainian Navy. And we've had other drills where the U.S. was practicing mock missile firings at Kaliningrad as well. So it seems like to me, it looks like we're bound to have some kind of an accident here at some point or some further escalation. I'm pretty sure with the HMS Defender incident, when they came just about 12 nautical miles off the coast of Crimea and had to be basically scared away by the Russians. I think it was the first time they used live fire, dropping bombs in their course to the Russians to get the British to leave after they were warned off like over the course of 20 minutes and basically refused to leave until those bombs were dropped, and they left 4 minutes afterwards. As Putin said, this isn't World War III. There wasn't really a chance of it going that way, but this, like in the situation with in China's near abroad, particularly under Biden, it seems like it's a never-ending cycle, and so I don't know where we go from here. The Ukraine, Zelensky wants to bring the Americans into the Normandy format with Russia, Ukraine, Germany, and France. Which, the Americans are much like, as James Carden was talking about with Scott Horton, they're much like the Lithuanians and the Poles, the Baltic states and Poland. They're much more hawkish than the Germans and the French, who are more of a moderating influence when it comes to situations like Ukraine. As Rick Roswell said, he goes, it's like bringing it's like Mexico inviting Russia to get involved in border disputes with America. So it just, I don't know where we're going from here, but it seems like we're really headed towards escalated tensions with Russia, especially after these new sanctions were announced after what we thought was a good meeting with between Biden and Putin. Just the Russians are constantly being slapped in the face, and I feel like we're kind of relying on the patience of Putin.
All right. Well, Connor, thank you so much for coming back on the show. I really appreciate it as always. You can find Connor on Twitter at FreeMinds96. I got that right, didn't I?
Oh, Freeman's Mind 96.
Freeman's Mind 96. Almost there this time. And anything he writes will be up at the Libertarian Institute. So libertarianinstitute.org to find all of mine and Connor's work. Connor, thanks so much for coming back on the show again. We'll have to do this soon.
Thanks as always, man.